Welcome to Partnerships for Profit, the podcast where we bring you inside the world of joint ventures, strategic partnerships, and powerful collaborations. Each episode, you'll dive into conversations with top entrepreneurs, visionaries, and business leaders, unlocking the secrets to building profitable relationships that drive growth and success. Whether you're looking to expand your network, find new referral partners, or scale your business, you're in the right place. Let's get started.
Hi, thanks so much for joining me for another episode of Partnerships for Profit. Today I'm joined by Michael Burnett, who is the founder of Burnett Risk Control International. He's an attorney with 30 years of experience and is a nationally recognized expert in the evaluation and resolution of sexual misconduct claims. Michael, thanks for being here.
It's good to be here.
Why don't you go ahead and give just a brief summary of your background, how you got involved in your current line of work?
Sure. So by background, I'm an insurance coverage attorney, and I worked at a large law firm in Chicago for many years, and we represented a number of domestic and international insurers of religious and nonprofit entities. And so even before the Archdiocese of Boston scandal hit in 2002, we were working on a number of claims involving not just priests, but other religious and other people like volunteers. And so during the course of doing that, I was an expert on on insurance coverage matters, but I became an expert on sexual abuse. When I went to mediations or informal settlement negotiations, I always made sure that I sat across the table from someone who'd been sexually abused, not just the guy in the shadows with the purse strings that, determined by how much an insurance company was willing to pay for a claim, but actually sat at the table. And I found that I connected very well with people who'd been sexually abused. And then over time, as I worked on them, I got a better sense for how to evaluate those claims. And so I left that law firm work over 22 years ago, and I started compiling a database of values from all over the world that now has well over 100,000 claims in it. And basically, I use that to value claims so that when I get a sexual misconduct claim, I not only know the insurance coverage issues, but I know the law of the jurisdiction in terms of defenses to liability or theories of liability, that kind of thing. But I also have data at my fingertips. And so I'm able to provide a kind of a broad-based enterprise type approach to the resolution of sexual misconduct claims. And at this point in time, I'm also the director of an administration. I'm the administrator of a compensation fund, where in this religious entity, we are giving compensation to people who are sexually abused. And I find that that's really the most gratifying part of my work right now is meeting with people who've been sexually abused, helping them resolve the claim and get the kind of help that they need.
Yeah, and specifically with your background, that makes sense why it would be good to have you in their corner because of just how much experience and a broad range of experience you bring to the table. So I appreciate you giving me some context there. What is probably the most shocking thing about sexual misconduct claims that most institutions underestimate in your experience?
I think probably their vulnerability to it. So I think that the thing that's interesting is that the places where sexual misconduct, especially involving children and minors, the places where those types of crimes are most likely to occur are in places you wouldn't expect, religious and nonprofit entities. And the reason for that is people who have those predilections, who are prone to sexually abuse people or be sexually attracted to minors, are people who exploit trust relationships. And religious and nonprofit entities really are able to do what they do based on trust among people in their congregations or people that they serve. And so the biggest, most shocking thing is that the people who would least expect it are the ones that are oftentimes confronted with that kind of a problem. But in addition to that, the people that they would least expect to ever be guilty of such a thing are the ones that betray that kind of trust. So that's kind of a broad-based answer to that.
Okay. Yeah, working on trust. What for the institutions that have earned that trust, it's probably, I would imagine it's not like it's probably it's probably a gradual fade into these types of situations. What are some behaviors that could land an institution in that type of like legal hot water?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of them. First of all, on an institutional level, and then also on a perpetrator level. So institutionally, I would say that where you could really be vulnerable to this kind of a problem and liability exposure is if you assume that because of who you are and what you do, that is a benefit to the community and to the world, that somehow you're immune from that. And so traditionally, if you look at some of the big institutions that have really been beset by these issues that have been very public, like Catholic Church or the Boy Scouts of America, now religious entities, and nonprofit entities, if you look at those institutions, they're all institutions that serve the community in a really beneficial way. And they've been able to use that trust and that really stellar reputation as currency for what they do. And that's a good thing. We want there to be religious and charitable and nonprofit institutions that help in the community. But one of the biggest mistakes you can make is to assume that because you have those motives and because you have those really benevolent missions, that somehow that makes you immune from this. When in reality, if you look at it, the people who have these types of propensities are attracted to your institutions that are like that because they know that there's that level of trust there. And so it's very easy. And these are, people who are pedophiles, for example, are typically very crafty people. They groom not just their victim, but they groom their victim's family so that they can ingratiate themselves into a family and into the hearts and minds of minors, children. But in addition to that, they groom an entire community, whether that is a congregation, a religious congregation, or whether it is a Boy Scout troop or some kind of a charitable organization. They groom the entire organization, and oftentimes they appear to be, or they present as heroic characters, a minister or a volunteer or a scoutmaster, whatever the case may be. They really become well known as someone in the community that is really to be trusted. And you oftentimes hear when there's a scandal that erupts someplace and that there's been an allegation of sexual abuse, what you will often hear in the community, especially in the smaller community of a church or a charity or something, oh, we know he would never do that because he's such a trustworthy guy. He loves kids. He's all about the kids. And so people assign all kinds of virtues to people that are not necessarily well-deserved or well-earned.
Because of the institutions that they've aligned with, and like you said, like they kind of take on this hero persona to kind of have a double layer of protection and those sort of things.
That's exactly right. And especially when you're looking at a situation where people might come forward to disclose their sexual abuse decades after it happens. I think that studies show that the average age of someone who was sexually abused to come forward is age 52 or 53, right around that age.
Wow.
And so by that time, not only are there statute of limitations, defenses, and things like that, but also the perception of the abuser in the community might well have become even more burnished with trust and heroic motives and things like that. And one example I use sometimes is if you have a priest or a minister who is the head of a particular congregation and is beloved by everyone in the congregation, and maybe somewhat older, maybe wears a cardigan sweater, almost like fits the whole central casting image of what a great person would be. They may not even be sexually abusing anymore. But what that congregation typically didn't know is they did not know that man maybe 40 years before, when he had a higher testosterone level, when maybe he was less able to control his sexual urges. And so it's even more difficult for his congregants to believe that he would be capable of something like that.
Okay. Man, yeah, it sounds like some of these cases really can get super complex with the time delay there, with witnesses coming forward and everything. Can you go into any detail about some, like again, without naming names, but like a case, like what were some of the attributes of that were takeaways?
I can give some broad descriptions of things. One of the things that I have run across a lot, because there's a whole spectrum of sexual abuse, and I think just as kind of to preface it, there's a sense that, oh well, if the abuse is in grade higher or more severe, then that will mean that the person is even more harmed psychologically, emotionally, and that's oftentimes true. What's often true also, though, is it's someone who on in the whole scheme of things, the type of abuse may have been very momentary, may have been not as, may not have been penetrative. And one would maybe expect those people to, deal with it or whatever, whatever someone might say, but you can never say that because people might have suffered something that was really, in the whole scheme of things, less serious than others. But given where they are in their lives, given their family background, that incident could take on a disproportionate level of severity in their lives. But one of the things that I've seen a number of times, and especially when you're talking about teenagers who are in adolescence, they're growing into their sexuality, they're maybe experimenting sexually, you'll oftentimes see situations where they develop an affection for and maybe feelings of love for their abuser. And that's not a unique thing. That happens across the board. You see that in peer-on-peer relationships as well. But I've worked on a number of claims where the level of abuse in terms of the actual acts of abuse are really, really serious and involve penetrative abuse. And there's a number of different kinds of penetrative abuse. And yet, the person who has come forward is only themselves coming to terms with the fact that what happened to them was abuse.
Yeah.
Oftentimes they've gone through well into adulthood a belief that they had been engaged in a consensual and a loving relationship, and that the sexual acts that they engaged in were part of a consensual expression of that love. And it's only when they get older, maybe they have a series of incidents that happen in their lives, when they begin to appreciate that what happened to them was in fact really seriously abusive, and that those feelings that they developed for their abuser were exploited by their abuser to enable him or her to do, ever more serious things. And so that can be really difficult, especially when you're dealing with things like, and I don't know how graphic you want me to get, but when you're dealing with things like sodomy, which is anal penetration, when those are some of the most serious forms of sexual abuse. But if people believe that they're in a consensual relationship, even though they may only be 13 or 14 or 15 years old, it's really difficult for that person to come to terms with, and may develop an additional trauma from coming to terms with the fact, well, this wasn't just a love relationship that was lost and there was a breakup. I was the victim of abuse. And that can be in and of itself a traumatic realization. And so oftentimes those people are difficult or have a difficulty because up until that moment, they haven't even appreciated the fact that maybe they needed some form of counseling or some kind of help.
And you mentioned earlier that it's been a personal joy of yours to be able to provide, it's certainly not closure, right? But you provide the affirmation and the empathy that comes with resolving some of these cases. I can appreciate that can be a very fulfilling aspect of what you're doing.
It is fulfilling. You made an interesting remark about it being joyful. It's interesting. That's an interesting way to put it. I think that
maybe I'll take that back. Maybe not.
No, that's all right. But it's interesting because it is very fulfilling. That's a really good word. And I think it does take a lot of empathy, but the work itself can be really heartbreaking.
I can imagine.
And what's interesting to me, I'll just as an aside, one of the biggest compliments I've ever had is when the wife of a victim survivor looked across the table at me and said, well, you're not like any lawyer I've ever met. And I think that's probably in part due to the reputation that lawyers have, but also because when I am engaging with people who've been sexually abused, and by the way, also with the institution that employed me, or the person was a volunteer, the institution, the insurance companies, the attorneys on all sides, when I'm engaging with those people, I try to bring empathy, and I try to bring a measure of just normalcy, if that makes any sense, because you can't register shock and things like that, even though you may be feeling it inside. But what's really important is for that person to understand that they are not to blame, that they did not do anything to deserve this. They're not at fault. And to try to make that person understand that what happened to them was wrong, was a criminal act, and was really traumatic, but that they need not take that on, or they need not persist in holding on to that as something that they've done. And I think that to try to get them on that journey of healing requires some measure of empathy, and also the ability to just listen. And one of the things also that I found really in the last few years is some people, and again, let me back up a little bit. I have to gauge each moment when I'm working with someone. But some people you can tell are desperate to give expression to what happened to them, and to be able to have a conversation beyond something that's kind of superficial.
Sure.
And yet that's particularly challenging because in these types of claims, there can be so much trauma and there can be so many really difficult to hear or to say facts about what actually happened and who did it to them. That sometimes there's a reticence to do that. People might be, reticent to say, like, is this what happened to you? But one of the things that I've found, and especially with working with a lot of men who've been sexually abused by men, is that there's still in our society is a stigma attached to homosexuality. And especially when you're in religious institutions where they may have very doctrinal attitudes or dogma-based attitudes about homosexuality and that kind of thing. There can be a real shame that goes along with that, which is really unfortunate. And part of my role I see is not just helping give someone compensation, but helping, hopefully, them getting on a journey so that they can let go of some of that shame and some of that trauma. And so sometimes, depending on the circumstances, if I can tell that the person is having difficulty saying something, especially if I already know what it is because of the materials that I've had to review, I can in a gentle way say, is this what you're talking about? Is this what they did to you? And sometimes you can see people physically relax. It's like someone has taken that burden away from them, that they have not had to say it, but that they can acknowledge that I've said something that happened to them. And then once that's on the table, we can go from there in terms of trying to address all the various issues that come along with that kind of abuse.
Yeah. You had mentioned that some of these cases are especially difficult because of how long of a time delay it's been. Are there, because of that fact alone, I would imagine that these issues are probably pretty persistent, much more persistent than we would probably understand within the community. You mentioned a couple because of your background, but are there specific industries that are more susceptible to this type of behavior? Again, not as a maybe attracting those bad actors.
Yes, religious and nonprofit entities, primarily charities, schools, public school systems. If you look at what's happening in California right now, there are enormous multi-million-dollar verdicts and settlements that are coming out of sexual abuse that occurred in public schools. And many people are familiar with what's happened in the Catholic Church. The movie Spotlight several years ago. I don't know if you saw that movie or not, but it dealt with the disclosure of sexual abuse in the Archdiocese of Boston by the Spotlight section of the Boston Globe. So people are familiar with that, and they make that makes the headlines. But one of the things that's been noted by a number of researchers is that the problem of sexual abuse in public schools dwarfs what's happened not only in the Catholic Church, but in many religious and nonprofit entities.
Interesting. Wow.
And if you think about it, that's not so shocking because teachers and coaches and counselors in schools have a lot of direct and sometimes emotionally intimate interactions with minors. From preschool all the way up to senior in high school. And so there is that availability, there's that access. So if people if they have those proclivities, or if they're like profoundly immature people, they may be in a position of authority in the community as a teacher or as a coach or an administrator, that kind of thing. But we don't know necessarily how immature they may be. And so there's that vulnerability. So it's across the board. And the other thing to understand is that the vast majority of sexual abuse of minors in this country is abuse perpetrated upon prepubescent girls by adult male family members, whether that's a father or a grandfather, an uncle, a stepdad. That's where the vast majority of the abuse takes place. And the difficulties associated with that are that there's enormous pressure placed on a small child. If they come to the mother or to someone in the community to say that they've been abused by a family member, there's this enormous pressure to stop that, to stop the reporting of that claim, to not let that person go forward, because they'll say things like, well, daddy will go to prison, or our family will lose our home, will be, that kind of thing. And that means that the abused child who's already dealing with that trauma now has it magnified, because the people that are closest to that child and most responsible for their well-being are the ones putting really negative pressure on them. So it's not an institution, it's a family, but there are a number of different institutions, places like that, that abuse is prevalent.
So you mentioned public school, for example, as another community of people that tends to have this kind of behavior take place because of its proclivity for those reasons you mentioned. For the individuals for the abusers in this case, would you say that the majority of the cases that you've worked with, they're like acting alone, and is it only when there's other members within the community that are aware of an issue, and because of those reasons you just mentioned as well, that like, well, we don't want this to be in the spotlight, we don't want all of these financial reasons or emotional reasons, so we're going to keep this quiet? Is that typically the case, or are there situations where, I guess what I'm asking is it typically an individual that's doing this, or is it like, are there cases where there's multiple individuals that are aware of each other's abuse that are like?
It's a really good question. And I think that the easy answer, the quick answer to that is typically these are individuals, because they recognize that what they're doing is a crime, a very serious crime. And I think my suspicion is that they're less likely to kind of widen that circle of trust to bring in others. That said, I think with the internet and social media and the types of dark net that's out there, that increasingly, my perception is that increasingly there are, for lack of a better word, like cabal people, certainly with respect to child pornography, where people on the internet will share child pornography, and sometimes that can lead to being in each other's presence and that kind of thing. I have worked on a number of claims over the years that involved groups of abusers, and I always found that to be really not only tragic and criminal, but really strange from the perspective that if you are someone who is inclined to sexually abuse a child, how do you go about finding a compatriot to do that with you, or to be part of your group or gang, whatever you want to call it? How do you introduce that topic? And I've often wondered that, like, what those moments were like when two people like-minded of a criminal mind found each other. Like, how did that happen? And I actually think if we could delve into that and figure out some of that, it might help us in a broader sense that these people, I think, although they're very crafty and they know they need to get the trust of not just a child, but the family and the community, that there are certain ways to probably get into their brains, so to speak, and see if that would help us to target them, to figure out who it is, what behaviors are really prevalent and noteworthy. So I do think that's a really good question. The second part of the question is an even better one, which is who knew about it? And it is not unusual that there are people who knew or should have known. And, oftentimes you'll see in a church environment that there is a person who's abusing, maybe the youth minister is abusing people. And that individual is oftentimes surrounded by many adults who have taken note of their disturbing behavior patterns, or someone has already come forward. And there are a number of responses to that, sometimes disbelief. And so if someone goes to the head of the congregation or to the head of the volunteer groups and says, so-and-so is abusing me or is abusing my friend or my sister, it's not uncommon for people to say, how dare you say such a thing about such a wonderful man? You're destroying his reputation. Never speak of this again. So there's that. But then there are also people who take note of it. And strangely, I've worked on a series of claims before where there's almost a tolerance of that kind of criminal behavior, almost because they're good at what they do, so to speak. They do a good job working with youth, or they're good administrators, whatever the case may be. And so there's that piece of it where you realize that sometimes there's a complicity in the community, not intentional maybe, but there's a complicity. And some of that has to do with not believing, because, you could say someone's a great administrator, but if you believe that they're sexually abusing children, hopefully most people would say, I don't care how good of an administrator you are, you've got to go, that kind of thing.
Yeah, because when you brought up school, that made me think of my son, who's like pretty young, but we still have him in a program. Because I'm wondering, like, I can imagine it already being difficult to kind of determine if there's an individual, but if that individual has an ally, not just like things under like a trust that, hey, we don't want to disclose things because it will ruin the organization, but an actual ally in these things like that would even be harder, I would imagine, to weed out institutionally.
That's exactly right. And oftentimes an unwitting ally. And, I'll give you an example of a daycare center, for example, where there may be someone on staff who has exhibited really troubling behaviors that, with risk managers and with people who are experts on sexual abuse, those would be huge red flags. Mm-hmm. But if there hasn't been good training among daycare staff and teachers and responsible people, if there hasn't been good training to begin with, the people may not even pick up on those red flags. But the other piece of it is, even if they do pick up on red flags, we don't like to believe that our colleagues, that our friends, our fellow employees are capable of doing such things. Yep. And also, depending on the age group of the child, the types of behaviors that are really troubling can appear to be something else. And so when confronted with an allegation or a concern that someone is behaving inappropriately and potentially sexually with a child, the temptation is to say, oh, well, we have to change diapers in a daycare center. So no, they're just changing diapers. Or sometimes children wet their pants. They have to change. And those are all true. But it's about how people go about those activities that the red flag really takes place. And so that's really important. And that's why there's such an importance about training. And there are some really great training programs out in the world today. And a lot of them are geared specifically for religious entities or particular religious entities, or, organizations like the Boy Scouts of America, who and the Catholic Church, who've learned the hard way how the absence of those types of programs really harmed them and the community. And so now when you look for programs that will provide really good training and arm people with information, a lot of times you'll find them in those organizations, those institutions that really have a bad history because they've had to learn the hard way, and now they're doing a much better job. And that's really critically important when you're talking about, to your point, an ally or an unwilling ally in the community. No one wants to be that ally. And so nowadays, people will pick up on behaviors if they've had training, even of good friends. And I worked on a series of cases in Texas where there was an individual in this parish who was really beloved, and he was in charge of a daycare program, and he was much beloved. But when people got the training, and he was actually in the training seminar, other people who just loved the guy started to recognize that some of the red flag behaviors that were being discussed applied directly to him. They went up to the trainer, they said, hey, listen, we're sure this isn't happening, but we feel like we should say something because everything you said, this guy checks off the boxes. Wow. The trainer said, you know what, you're probably right, but good for you for recognizing that there are these behaviors. Why don't you, talk with so-and-so administrator or whatever? And as it turned out, the guy had been abusing.
Wow.
And if it hadn't been for people in that community, that small religious community that really admired and respected him, but who had been trained on ways to identify troubling behaviors, he might still be doing that today. And so that's how you avoid becoming an unwitting ally, is to make sure that you have good training early and often.
Could you tell me a little bit more about that? I obviously we can't go into the details of training. Don't have time for that. But like, what does that overall look like for people within a community, or even people that aren't a part of community, but just it would be still very good knowledge for them to be aware of so that they can keep their eyes open for those types of red flags? Like, what does that training look like?
It's a really good question. There are in broad themes. One of the things is that an adult who is not a parent of a child should, as often as possible, not be alone with that child. There may be instances where a child, and if it's a doctor, let's say, that it might make sense for a child to be alone with the doctor. But even then, a young child should certainly be with a parent in the doctor's office. Yeah. But also teachers, volunteers, youth ministers, priests, rabbis, anybody that has access to children. If they are in a situation where they are alone with the child, that's a huge red flag right there. It doesn't mean they're doing anything wrong, but it can mean two different things. Number one, it could be that they are grooming that child and that they're not respecting the rules. And that's one of the huge red flags, when someone behaves as though the rules do not apply to them. So if the rule is, hey, in this church, no adult is allowed to be alone with a child, there have to be at least two adults. And that person is doing it, that's a huge red flag. The other thing about that is, in terms of a training perspective, is even if nothing is happening, the fact that someone would be alone with the child and breaking that rule can, in a sense, be, again, unwittingly, grooming that child for someone else to abuse them. If a child doesn't realize or isn't raised in an environment where they're not alone with someone, where the danger is being taken out, then when the person comes along who might have that proclivity and is alone with them, it won't set off alarm bells in the child's brain. Yeah. And a lot of good training programs now are geared toward children as well as adults.
Okay.
But the other thing, the rules thing is a big deal. Like when someone behaves as though the rules don't really apply to them, and then when they're confronted about that, they don't say, wow, my bad, I didn't think about that. Instead, they start to justify it. They're now justifying taking a stance that is directly contrary to rules and training that they've been given. And that
so more than just offensive, but justifying that behavior.
Right, exactly. Like, oh, this child had something personal to tell me that's happening in the home. Of course, I would not, broaden the scope of people there. And certainly there are parents and role models and adults in a child's life that can play that, they can play that role of being a confidant when a child is in some kind of distress. But again, there are ways to go about doing that. And the best way to do that is to make sure that no adult is ever alone with the child. And so there are different protocols that can be employed to make sure that people won't be alone with a child, even though they may be in a position where they should be reporting, let's say, suspected abuse in the home or that kind of thing. The other thing that I think is a red flag nowadays, and it's a difficult one, and that is when you hear people say, oh, he loves kids, or she loves the kids, or she's great with teenage boys. He's great with little kids. He just relates to them. That's great to have people who can really connect with children and, who need really good adult role models. But when you hear that about someone a lot, it can be a red flag. And you kind of hate to be in that position of saying that, because it could be completely innocent. But again, it's not necessarily the fact that training is going to root out innocent behavior, but just to be able to say our concept of innocent behavior needs to broaden, and our concept of troubling behaviors need to broaden.
Yeah, that's interesting. So if that, to me, what I heard is like, if that's their identifying mark, like just really great with kids, and that's like all somebody talks about them, like it doesn't have to mean that's a red flag, but that means like, hey, maybe we should investigate just a little bit just to kind of clear this person.
And especially if that behavior of connecting really well with kids comes from a place of immaturity. And that's something that I've seen a lot, which is a huge red flag, which is someone doesn't just relate well to children. They relate to them almost on a peer level.
Interesting.
So that you're dealing with an adult who's almost behaving like a 10-year-old child in their midst. That's a concern to me, because it's not just that they relate well to a child and therefore it could be a positive influence, but that they relate to them in a really immature way. And so if you think about it, when that person is acting like a peer, like of a prepubescent child, they're not really in that moment fulfilling the role of a role model or of an adult that can be a confidant or adult that can be a protector. They've now assumed the role of a child. And that's something that a lot of us, I think, have seen. And there may have been something that was even disturbing about it, but we didn't have the language or the context to put the nail on the head and say, oh, that's potentially troubling behavior.
Oh, okay. Well, this topic was pretty heavy, I'll say that, but it was also very, very informative. So happy to have had that Any, like, just wrapping up here, any message you would give to, like, leaders of these institutions, of these communities, of these organizations that, not just to avoid a scandal for the sake of avoiding a scandal, but just for the sake of these children that we really do care about, like their future and their well-being. Like, what would you say to these leaders wrapping up here?
Well, I'd start by saying you just hit the nail on the head, that if you're a leader in an institution, that the worst approach you can take is the desire to avoid scandal. The big scandal is the fact that an adult has been sexually abusing a child. That's the scandal.
Yeah.
If you try to approach it from the standpoint of how can we avoid scandal, or how can we prevent people in a broader community to learn about this having happened in our community or our institution, that's where the wheels fall off. The best way for leaders to handle this is, number one, to be preventive and to be proactive and to acknowledge the fact that this can happen anywhere, that people of all stripes can do this kind of thing, and that we are really all tasked with the obligation to try to be proactive and to prevent it. So that if, God forbid, it should happen in your institution, the best response is to realize that it can happen, that really false claims are pretty rare, and that if you're confronted with this, you need to do something. Contact law enforcement first and foremost. Contact people who are in the know about what to do about this, whether that's a rape center or, the authorities, that kind of thing. And then to try to provide, to the greatest extent possible, the kinds of services that victims would need to try to get them on a journey of healing, to try to help them understand that they've done nothing wrong, that kind of thing. And to make sure that you allow not only law enforcement, but the other industries and the other institutions to do the work that they are trained to do, to root this out and to really come to some way of, form of justice. And one of the mistakes that's been made across the board, whether you're talking about residential schools, scouting organizations, public schools, religious entities, charities, one of the biggest mistakes that's been made is that people personalize it. They fear that this will mean the destruction of their institution. And that the way that you can bring that about, and a lot of bankruptcies across the country, like the Boy Scouts bankruptcy, a lot of Catholic dioceses have gone bankrupt. That is a direct result of people who did not handle it appropriately and who didn't take note of what they should have taken note of. And so the number one thing that leaders can do are to respect people that come forward, even if you think, well, wow, this happened so long ago. Could it really be true? Respect those people. Don't personalize it. Don't assume that you know. Report it to people who do know and who do this for a living and who are experts in it. And so that's the number one thing you can do. And then just to be there, especially if you're a religious or charitable entity, to be there as a source of healing and a source of comfort to people who were sexually abused.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The scandal has already happened. So we're like, there's nothing to avoid now. It has already happened. And so let's do our due diligence to make this not even worse than it already is.
That's exactly right. And one more thing I'd tack onto that, if you don't mind, and that is institutions typically have lawyers and insurance companies, and those are all really important things. And if one of your employees or one of your volunteers or someone like that has been accused of sexual abuse, first thing you do is you contact, law enforcement. But you should also contact your attorneys and your insurance carriers, because it was not uncommon for someone to file a lawsuit to seek some kind of compensation or recovery to make them whole based on what happened essentially on your watch. What I would caution leaders of institutions to do, though, is to be really careful about the people that you choose to be your attorneys or your risk managers. Find people who have empathy, find people who understand the potential problems, not just sexual abuse, but any number of different things. If you have a religious or nonprofit entity, that's very different from a commercial enterprise. And so find people that know your pain points, that know what your mission is, and know how devastating things like this can be, and will approach their representation of you from a standpoint of compassion and empathy, not just for you and your needs, but for the people that have been ostensibly harmed on your watch. And also insurance carriers who understand that where this has been handled well, they are really great models of how to do it. Unfortunately, you don't see that all the time.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. Michael, thank you for being here and giving me some helpful knowledge. It means a lot.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Where can viewers go to find more about you and what you do and how you specifically help and how you potentially could help?
They could go to my website. The name of my company is Burnett Risk Control International. I have a website. I'm launching my database for subscription purchase now, and it's called Burnett Index. We are putting the website to be out there within the next couple of days.
Okay,
People
great.
can go to that if they want to learn more about it. If they want to learn more about this topic in general, you can just probably Google search, and you can put things in there like Boy Scouts and what happened there. There are all kinds of different institutions that have had to deal with this, and there's law that's come about because of that. So there are any number of different places you could go to get information. But with respect to me, Burnett Risk Control International or Burnett Index.
Great. Michael, thank you for being here again. And for the listeners, thank you for listening. This, again, is Partnerships for Profit, powered by LeDuc Entertainment. And I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Partnerships for Profit. We hope you've gained valuable insights on how to form profitable partnerships and take your business to the next level. Be sure to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. Got a partnership story to share or someone you'd like to see featured on the show? Reach out to us. Until next time, keep building those partnerships for profit.